The departure of assumptions. A routine flight. A fateful encounter. The airport was a symphony of controlled chaos. Announcements blared overhead. Travelers hurried through security, and the faint scent of brewed coffee lingered in the air. It was a typical morning at JFK International Airport, where thousands of passengers funneled toward their respective gates, unaware that their flight could hold more than just a destination. It could hold a lesson. Seated near Gate 24, Amari Holloway, a 17-year-old high school senior, scrolled through her phone. She wasn't a stranger to air travel, but today's flight was different. First-class seats, courtesy of her father's generosity, were a luxury she wasn't entirely used to. Next to her, her 12-year-old brother, Zaire, shifted excitedly, his fingers tapping against the armrest of his seat. "How much longer?" he asked, rocking back and forth in his chair. Amari glanced at the large digital display above the boarding doors. 15 minutes, she replied, stuffing her phone into the pocket of her hoodie. "You'd think you'd flown enough times to stop asking." "But we've never flown first class," Zaire pointed out, flashing a wide grin. "Dad said it's next level fancy." Amari smirked, nudging him lightly. "Well, don't act like it's your first time, or they'll think we don't belong there." Zaire's excitement dimmed slightly, and his posture straightened. He looked around at the other passengers waiting in the first-class boarding line. Business professionals in tailored suits, older couples dressed in stylish but comfortable clothing, and a few families who appeared just as out of place as they felt. "I mean it," Amari continued, lowering her voice. "You know how people can be." Zaire nodded, understanding the unspoken weight behind her words. Boarding the plane. When the boarding announcement finally came, Amari and Zaire approached the gate with their tickets in hand. The gate attendant, a middle-aged man with a receding hairline, barely glanced at them before scanning their passes and waving them through. The moment they stepped onto the aircraft, Zaire let out an audible "whoa." The first-class cabin was unlike anything he had imagined. The seats were wider, spaced farther apart, with footrests and built-in screens for each passenger. There were fresh pillows, warm towels, and even glassware already set on the trays. "This is crazy," Zaire whispered, his eyes gleaming with excitement. Amari chuckled. "Just sit down before you embarrass yourself." They found their seats minus 4A and 4B, toward the middle of the first-class section. Zaire immediately took the window seat, pressing his face against the glass as he watched the ground crew move about outside. Amari settled into her own, adjusting the seatbelt and stretching her legs comfortably. Everything seemed perfect, until the moment she arrived. The assumption. Miss Evelyn Calloway, the leave flight attendant, moved through the first-class cabin with an air of practiced authority. Her uniform was impeccable, her blonde hair twisted into a flawless bun, and her sharp gaze assessed every detail of the passengers settling into their seats. She was good at her job, efficient, meticulous, and professional, but there was a flaw in her methods. She often trusted her instincts over logic, and today her instincts led her astray. As she scanned the passengers, her eyes fell upon Amari and Zaire. Her brow furrowed slightly, barely perceptible to the untrained eye, but Amari caught it. The hesitation, the doubt. Miss Calloway approached them with a perfectly rehearsed smile, though it did little to soften the edge in her voice. "Excuse me," she said, her tone firm yet polite. "Are you certain you're in the correct seats?" Amari looked up from her phone, her fingers tightening slightly around the device. "Yes, these are ours." Miss Calloway extended a hand. "May I see your tickets, please?" Zaire, still in awe of the luxury around him, blinked in confusion. "But we already showed them at the gate." "Zaire," Amari cut in, her voice calm but controlled. She reached into her pocket, pulling out the printed boarding passes and handing them over. Miss Calloway examined them, her expression unreadable, but the slight twitch of her lips betrayed her. "Who purchased these seats for you?" she asked. Amari's patience thinned. "Our father." Miss Calloway's lips pursed, and she nodded before handing the tickets back. "Of course. Enjoy your flight." Mary exhaled slowly, watching as the flight attendant turned and walked toward the galley. "What was that about?" Zaire whispered. Mary didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned toward the window, letting the weight of the moment settle. "She didn't think we belonged here." Zaire frowned. "But why?" Mary looked at him then, her expression serious. "You know why." Zaire slumped back in his seat, a realization dawning on him. He had read about these things, seen them in movies, but he had never experienced it so directly. Until now. Escorted out. Minutes later, Miss Calloway returned, this time, accompanied by another flight attendant, an older man with silver-streaked hair, and an air of no-nonsense professionalism. "Mr. and Miss Holloway," he addressed them, "we need you to step into the jet bridge for a quick verification." Mary's stomach tightened. "For what?" Miss Calloway clasped her hands behind her back. "It's just a security measure." Zaire gripped his armrests, his fingers curling into a fist. "But we showed you our tickets." The older flight attendant, Mr. Hensley, sighed. "I assure you, it won't take long. We just need to confirm a few details." Mary felt the stares now. Passengers turning their heads, their whispers like static in the background. But no one spoke up. No one said a word. With a quiet breath, she grabbed her bag and nudged Zaire to stand. He hesitated, but he followed. The two of them walked down the aisle, their heads held high, though Mary's hands trembled slightly at her sides. They stepped off the plane, the heavy door shutting behind them with an ominous finality. A security officer stood nearby, watching them closely, as if they were criminals rather than paying passengers. Mary reached for her phone, her fingers shaking as she scrolled to her father's number. Zaire stood beside her, shoulders slumped, the excitement from earlier completely gone. She pressed the call button. The moment he answered, her voice was unsteady. "Dad," she said, struggling to contain her frustration. "They just kicked us off the plane." Silence. Then, a slow, measured response. "Who did?" Mary turned her head slightly, watching as Miss Calloway and Mr. Hensley reboarded the plane without a second glance. Her jaw clenched. "The flight crew," she said quietly. There was another pause. But this time, it wasn't confusion or shock. It was something else, something colder. "Stay where you are," her father said, his voice unreadable. "Don't speak to anyone." His next words sent a chill down her spine. "I'll handle this." Mary lowered the phone from her ear, her fingers still gripping it tightly. She turned to Zaire, who looked up at her with worried eyes. "What's Dad going to do?" he whispered. Mary exhaled slowly, shaking her head. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I don't think they're ready for it." The weight of a name. A father's fury in silence. Mary and Zaire stood in the terminal, feeling the weight of dozens of passing stares. Travelers bustled around them, moving toward their respective gates, oblivious to the injustice that had just unfolded. To the outside world, they were just two kids standing by the jet bridge, waiting for another flight, waiting for something, anything, to make sense of what had just happened. Zaire sat down on one of the plastic chairs lining the terminal, his fingers tightening around the straps of his backpack. His usual excitement had dimmed, replaced with confusion and something heavier, something neither of them had been forced to process in such a direct way before. Mary, however, remained standing. Her grip on her phone was tight, her breathing measured. She was waiting, and when her father's name flashed across the screen, she answered without hesitation. "Dad," she breathed. Darius Holloway's voice was calm, but it carried a weight she recognized, a quiet intensity. "I need the flight number," he said. Mary knew that tone. It was the same tone he used in high-stakes meetings, the same tone that made board members go silent, the same tone that demanded absolute obedience. She quickly relayed the flight details. The airline, the gate number, the names of the flight attendants who had thrown them off. A silence stretched on the other end. Then, in a voice so controlled it sent a shiver up her spine, he said, "Stay where you are." Mary swallowed. "Are we getting back on the plane?" Her father didn't answer immediately. But when he finally spoke, his words were sharp, deliberate. "You'll be back on that plane," he said. "And so will she." The shift in power. 15 minutes passed. The plane was still at the gate, the first-class passengers likely sipping their complimentary beverages, unaware that the decision to take off was no longer in the hands of the captain. Mary felt it before she saw it. A change in the air. A shift in the balance of power. It was in the way the gate agents suddenly stood straighter, the way one of them began whispering furiously into a phone. It was in the way the security officer, who had been stationed near them with casual disinterest, suddenly stiffened. Then she saw them. 2 men in tailored suits, moving with purpose through the terminal. Their expressions unreadable. Corporate. Zaire noticed them too, sitting up straighter. "Who are they?" he whispered. Mary didn't need to guess. Dad sent them. The taller of the 2 men, a sharp-jawed executive with salt and pepper hair, approached the gate. He didn't look at the gate agent. He looked through her. "I need to speak with the captain," he said, his voice smooth but firm. The gate agent hesitated. "Sir, the flight is preparing for departure." "Not anymore," he said simply. And just like that, the plane that had been preparing to taxi was now frozen in place. The fall of a gatekeeper. Miss Calloway was in the galley, adjusting silverware and napkins when the call came through the intercom. "Miss Calloway, please report to the gate desk immediately." She frowned. Flight attendants were rarely summoned back to the terminal once boarding had been completed. It was a disruption to the schedule, a break in routine. And if there was one thing she despised, it was disorder. Still, she smoothed the front of her uniform, tucked a stray hair back into place, and made her way toward the exit. As she stepped onto the jet bridge, the first thing she saw was the security officer. The second thing she saw was the 2 men in suits. And the third. Her breath caught in her throat. Darius Holloway. She had seen his face in company newsletters, heard his name spoken with reverence in executive meetings, but seeing him in person, standing at the gate, his hands folded in front of him, his gaze fixed on her, was something else entirely. This was not a routine flight. This was something much, much bigger. Her heart pounded. She opened her mouth to speak, to maintain control of the situation, but before she could, one of the executives, a senior vice president, spoke first. "Miss Calloway," he said, voice crisp and professional, "you are to immediately escort Mr. and Miss Holloway back to their seats." She blinked. "What?" "You heard me," the man continued. "You will personally escort them back onto the aircraft." Miss Calloway felt the weight of the stairs, the passengers still lingering near the gate, the security officer who was now watching with quiet interest. I was following protocol," she stammered. Darius Holloway finally spoke. His voice was softer than she expected, but it was no less powerful. "Did you question any of the other first-class passengers?" She froze. The answer was obvious. No, she hadn't. His expression remained unreadable. Then it wasn't protocol. It was personal. The silence that followed was suffocating. She had never felt powerless before. Never been on the receiving end of scrutiny like this. She had spent years commanding cabins with authority, setting the rules, ensuring everything ran smoothly. And yet now she was the one waiting for orders. The executive beside Darius cleared his throat. "You will apologize," he said, "not just to Mr. and Miss Holloway, but to the entire first-class cabin. And upon arrival, you will report directly to the executive board for a disciplinary review." Miss Calloway's stomach dropped. A review. A corporate review meant one thing. Her career was on the line. For the first time in her professional life, she felt something unfamiliar. Fear. The walk of shame. Amari and Zaire followed Miss Calloway as she led them back onto the plane. But this time, she wasn't walking with the confident stride of someone in charge. She was walking with the knowledge that her mistake had just cost her everything. The first-class cabin fell silent as they stepped through the curtain. Passengers looked up, their gazes flicking between the two siblings and the woman who had thrown them off. Miss Calloway cleared her throat. She started, then hesitated. Amari folded her arms, waiting. Zaire shifted beside her. Miss Calloway swallowed hard. "I made an assumption," she said, her voice tight. "And I was wrong." Silence. She turned slightly, her gaze sweeping across the cabin. "I apologize for my actions," she said. "To both of you." Zaire blinked. Passengers exchanged looks. Some appeared indifferent. Others, they were watching with something close to satisfaction. The same passengers who had stayed silent when Amari and Zaire were removed were now enjoying the spectacle of seeing the person in power humbled. Amari met Miss Calloway's gaze. And then, quietly, she said, "Are you apologizing because you mean it, or because you got caught?" Miss Calloway stiffened, but she had no answer. Zaire exhaled beside his sister. The flight attendant turned, retreating toward the galley. Amari and Zaire settled back into their seats. But as the plane finally took off, the tension in the air remained. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The cost of assumptions. An uneasy flight. The airplane hummed with the steady rhythm of flight, its engines roaring softly beneath them. The first-class cabin, however, was heavy with something else, something invisible, yet suffocating. Tension. Amari and Zaire sat back in their rightful seats, the same ones from which they had been removed not long ago. But the excitement of flying first class had been stripped from them. Zaire, once eager to explore the entertainment system, now stared blankly at the screen in front of him, his fingers tapping idly against the armrest. Amari, on the other hand, remained alert. Her eyes flickered across the cabin, observing the way passengers carefully avoided looking at them. Some stared openly when they thought she wouldn't notice, while others buried themselves in books and tablets, pretending as if they hadn't just witnessed the unfolding of a quiet scandal. Miss Calloway had disappeared to the front of the cabin, her presence suddenly diminished. She was no longer the authoritative flight attendant commanding the space with confidence. Now she was just a woman who had been publicly humiliated, her control shattered. For once, she had no power. And Amari was sure she hated every second of it. A soft voice broke the silence between them. "This feels weird." Zaire had spoken, his voice barely above a whisper. He shifted in his seat, glancing at his sister before looking down at his hands. Amari sighed. "What do you mean?" Zaire hesitated. She apologized, right? So why doesn't it feel like it's over? Amari exhaled slowly, tilting her head against the headrest. "Because it's not." Zaire frowned. "You think Dad's going to fire her?" Amari didn't answer right away. Instead, she tapped her fingers against her thigh, deep in thought. Finally, she said, "I don't think it's just about firing her. I think Dad wants her to understand why she's wrong." Zaire scoffed. "She's an adult. Shouldn't she already know that?" Amari smirked, but it was humorless. "You'd think." A slight movement caught her eye. Hannah, the younger flight attendant, approached their row hesitantly, a small tray in hand. "Would you like anything to drink?" she asked, her tone softer than before. Amari studied her for a second before replying. "Water." Hannah nodded and set a glass down gently in front of each of them. For a moment, it seemed like she wanted to say something else, but she hesitated. Instead, she just stepped back and moved toward another row, her posture stiff. "She's nervous," Zaire muttered. Amari nodded. "She's paying attention." Conversations in the shadows. Miss Calloway, meanwhile, stood at the front of the cabin, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles turned white. She could feel the stares from first-class passengers, the judgment, the curiosity, the amusement at her downfall. She hated it. She had worked years to build her reputation as one of the best flight attendants in the airline. She prided herself on her professionalism, her ability to command respect in any situation. And now, in just a matter of minutes, she had lost all of it. Because of 2 kids. Because of a name. Because she had assumed. She could still hear Darius Holloway's voice in her head. Then it wasn't protocol. It was personal. Her stomach turned. Miss Calloway had been a part of this industry for years. She had made decisions every day. Quick, calculated judgments. Sometimes she had been right. Sometimes she had been wrong. But this was different. A shadow of movement pulled her attention to the cockpit door. The co-pilot stepped out, exchanging a brief word with the captain before heading toward the galley. She swallowed. She had already been humiliated in front of passengers, but now she had to answer to corporate. The first-class jury. Mary knew the moment Miss Calloway decided to face them again. It was in the way she straightened her posture, forced a professional expression onto her face, and walked, slowly, hesitantly, back toward their row. Passengers turned their heads, pretending to be occupied but still listening. She stopped in front of them. Zaire tensed beside Mary. Miss Calloway's lips pressed together before she spoke. "I'd like to personally offer a better service for the remainder of the flight," she said, voice tight with control. "If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to ask." Zaire looked up, expression unreadable. Mary tilted her head. "Would you have offered this if my last name wasn't Holloway?" A flicker of something crossed Miss Calloway's face, something she quickly buried. Mary continued, "Would you be here right now if it weren't for the fact that my father owns this airline?" Miss Calloway inhaled sharply. She hesitated. Passengers nearby were watching now, their curiosity piqued. A few rows over, a woman, likely in her late 60s, removed her reading glasses and folded her hands in her lap, listening intently. Miss Calloway swallowed. "I made a mistake," she finally admitted. Mary didn't blink. "You didn't answer my question." Miss Calloway exhaled, her hands tightening at her sides. "No," she said quietly. "I wouldn't have." There it was. The truth, finally spoken. The older woman from a few rows over cleared her throat. "You should have," she muttered. Miss Calloway stiffened, her face burning. She nodded once and stepped back, disappearing into the galley again. Zaire let out a slow breath. Well, that was awkward. Mary didn't respond. Because, for the first time, she thought Miss Calloway actually understood what she had done. Repercussions in the air. Back in the galley, Miss Calloway pressed her fingers to her temples. This wasn't just a bad flight. This was the flight, the one that could end her career. Hannah passed by, pausing as she noticed her distress. "Miss Calloway?" she asked hesitantly. Miss Calloway glanced at her, but there was no fight left in her. "I messed up." Hannah nodded. "Yeah," she said simply. "You did." Miss Calloway let out a hollow chuckle, rubbing her forehead. "And now?" Hannah shrugged. "Now you see what happens when the plane lands." Miss Calloway exhaled, leaning against the counter. "I've never been in this position before." Hannah tilted her head. "Then maybe it's time you learn what it feels like." Miss Calloway blinked. Hannah's voice was soft, but it carried a weight of its own. Miss Calloway had spent her entire career making decisions about who belonged and who didn't. And now, for the first time, she was the one who didn't belong. An inevitable landing. As the flight entered its final hour, Mary checked her phone. A message from her father. "Security is already in place. The executives have been notified. Be ready when you land." She exhaled. This wasn't just about an apology. This was about accountability. Zaire shifted beside her. "What do you think is going to happen when we land?" Mary didn't look away from her screen. "I think Miss Calloway's finally going to learn what it means when you assume the wrong things." Zaire nodded slowly. And as the plane began its descent, The tension in the air thickened once again. Because when they landed, when the doors opened, Miss Calloway wouldn't be the one in control. Darius Holloway would be. And for her, the real turbulence was only just beginning. The landing of consequences, a descent into the inevitable. The cabin lights flickered slightly as the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent into Los Angeles International Airport. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing." For most passengers, this announcement signaled the end of a long flight. The usual routine began. People stretching their legs, adjusting their seats, and collecting their personal belongings. Some murmured quietly to each other, making plans for their arrival. But for Miss Evelyn Calloway, this descent wasn't just a routine approach to lax. It was a free-fall. Her hands were clammy as she smoothed the front of her uniform, her thoughts swirling like turbulence in her mind. She had been in the airline industry for over a decade, and never, not once, had she felt this uncertain about her future. The moment they landed, she wouldn't just be stepping off another flight. She would be stepping into judgment. And the jury was waiting at the gate, a name that carries weight. Seated in 4A and 4B, Amari and Zaire remained silent as the plane glided lower. Through the window, the skyline of Los Angeles stretched in the distance, golden hues of the setting sun glinting off the city's buildings. Zaire exhaled. "So, it's almost over." Amari didn't take her eyes off the view outside. "For us, maybe." She didn't need to say the rest. Zaire already knew. For Miss Calloway, it was only beginning. The younger flight attendant, Hannah, passed through the first-class cabin, ensuring that all trays were secured and passengers were in their seats. When she reached Amari and Zaire, she hesitated for a second before speaking. "If there's anything you need before landing, just let me know," she said softly. Amari looked up, meeting Hannah's gaze. "Thanks." Hannah nodded and moved on. Miss Calloway, however, hadn't made a single pass through the cabin since her forced apology. She had retreated, perhaps trying to maintain what little dignity she had left. But there was no avoiding what came next. The landing. The wheels touched down with a soft jolt, the plane rolling down the runway before slowing. The familiar chime echoed through the cabin, signaling the end of the journey. Around them, passengers stretched, some already reaching for their bags. The seatbelt sign flicked off. And yet, no one moved to leave first class. Because everyone was waiting. Zaire leaned toward Amari, whispering, "They're watching her." Amari's gaze flickered to Miss Calloway. She stood at the front of the first-class cabin, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She was still trying to pretend she was in control. But the way her fingers trembled told another story. One by one, passengers began gathering their things. Some shot glances toward Amari and Zaire, an unspoken understanding passing between them. They had seen what had happened, and for once, they weren't looking away. And then, the door opened. A uniformed security officer stepped inside, his presence commanding immediate attention. Passengers turned in their seats, some murmuring. Others, especially those who had remained silent earlier, watched with wide eyes. Miss Calloway stiffened. The officer spoke. "Miss Calloway," he said, his voice calm but firm, "you need to come with us." Silence. The walk of shame. Miss Calloway's stomach twisted. This wasn't happening. Not like this. She had imagined a different ending, one where she could quietly handle the disciplinary review, where she could salvage what was left of her career. But Darius Holloway wasn't letting her slip away unnoticed. He was making the statement. Passengers weren't just hearing about what she had done. They were seeing the consequences. She forced herself to lift her chin, to straighten her posture. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. And yet, as she took her first step forward, she could feel it. The weight of judgment, the shift in perception, the loss of power. For years, she had commanded respect, had dictated the rules of the cabin. She had decided who belonged and who didn't. And now, Now she was the one who no longer belonged. As she passed Amari and Zaire, she hesitated for a fraction of a second. The girl's gaze was unreadable. The boy, however, his expression wasn't smug. It wasn't triumphant. It was disappointment. And that stung more than anything. Miss Calloway swallowed hard and kept walking. Passengers stepped aside, giving her space, just as they had when she had escorted Amari and Zaire off the plane. Only this time, she wasn't leading. She was being removed. A father's judgment. As Amari and Zaire stepped off the plane, they spotted him immediately. Darius Holloway stood just beyond the gate, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. The moment they saw him, Zaire exhaled in relief. "Dad." Darius's eyes swept over them, a silent assessment, ensuring they were unharmed. Amari met his gaze, nodding once, confirming what he already knew. They were fine. But this wasn't over. Because just beyond them, flanked by two corporate executives, stood Miss Calloway. She knew who he was, and now she knew what power truly looked like. Darius approached slowly, his footsteps measured, deliberate. Miss Calloway stood stiffly, but there was no hiding the fear in her eyes. "Mr. Holloway," she started, her voice forced into professional neutrality. Stop." The word was quiet, controlled, but it shut her up instantly. Darius studied her, his gaze steady. "I own this airline, Miss Calloway," he said finally, "which means I expect my employees to reflect the values I built it upon." Miss Calloway swallowed. "You assumed my children didn't belong," he continued, "not because of protocol, not because of any legitimate security concern, but because of assumption." A muscle in his jaw tightened. "My company doesn't have room for people who make those kinds of assumptions." Miss Calloway paled. The corporate executive beside her cleared his throat. "Mr. Holloway, if I may." "You may not," Darius cut in. His gaze never left Miss Calloway. "I expect your resignation," he said. "Effective immediately." Miss Calloway's throat bobbed. "Sir, please. This is not up for debate." Silence. Darius Holloway was not a man who repeated himself. Miss Calloway's lips trembled slightly, but she nodded. And just like that, it was over. The weight of change. As security led her away, Amari exhaled. Zaire glanced up at their father. "You think she learned her lesson?" Darius's gaze remained on Miss Calloway as she disappeared down the terminal. "Maybe," he said, "but what matters is that everyone watching did." Amari smirked slightly. Because he was right. This wasn't just about Miss Calloway. This was about making sure no one else made the same mistake. As they walked toward the exit, Amari cast one last glance over her shoulder, toward the passengers who had witnessed everything unfold. Some looked down, avoiding eye contact. Others, however, they were thinking. And that was enough. The weight of consequences. The last goodbye. Miss Calloway had walked through hundreds of terminals in her career. She had always been confident, her uniform pristine, her stride strong. She had never feared walking past executives or security officers before. But today, each step felt heavier. Passengers stared as she walked past, escorted by the two airline executives. Their eyes followed her, not in admiration, but in judgment. Some whispered. Others didn't bother to hide their curiosity. Her grip tightened around the strap of her carry-on. She had known her mistake the moment it had happened, but she had assumed, foolishly, that a simple apology would be enough. She had underestimated Darius Holloway. Now, her career was unraveling in real time, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. A corporate executive beside her, Mr. Langford, cleared his throat. "Miss Calloway, you will be escorted to the corporate office for an exit interview. Your employment will be terminated effective today." Her pulse pounded in her ears. "Mr. Langford," she started, forcing a composed tone. "Miss Calloway," he cut in smoothly. "We will discuss details in private, but let me be clear. This decision is final. A lump formed in her throat. For the first time in over a decade, she wasn't in control. And she hated it. A father's protection. Darius Holloway stood near the baggage claim, his phone in his hand, but his eyes remained on his children. Zaire was still adjusting, trying to shake off the discomfort of what had happened. His posture was tense, but not from exhaustion, from something deeper. Amari, on the other hand, was as composed as ever. But Darius knew his daughter. She was thinking, calculating, processing what had just happened. As the last of the passengers from their flight passed through the terminal, he finally spoke. "Let's go," he said. Zaire hesitated. "That's it." Darius raised an eyebrow. "What else do you want?" Zaire's fingers tightened around the straps of his backpack. "I don't know. Something more." Darius exhaled, motioning for them to follow. "She lost her job," he said. "She lost the respect of her coworkers, and she'll carry the weight of today for a long time." Zaire frowned. "But what if she doesn't change?" Darius glanced at his son. "She will." Zaire frowned. "How do you know?" Darius smirked slightly. "Because she's going to remember the way she felt today. The way everyone looked at her. The way she was forced to acknowledge what she did." Amari nodded slightly. "People like her don't like losing control." Darius met her gaze. "Exactly." They stepped out of the terminal and into the warm evening air. The city was alive with its usual energy. Honking cars, flashing signs, people rushing to their next destination. For Amari and Zaire, however, this wasn't just another flight. It was a reminder, a lesson, an understanding of how the world worked, and how, sometimes, it had to be forced to change. What's next? As they climbed into the black SUV waiting for them outside, Zaire leaned back against the seat, exhaling deeply. "I don't think I want to fly again for a while," he muttered. Darius chuckled. "You'll fly again, and next time, no one will question where you belong." Zaire smirked. "Because of our name." Darius shook his head. "No." Zaire frowned. "Then why?" Darius's expression hardened slightly. "Because you'll make sure they don't." Zaire thought about that for a moment before nodding slowly. Amari glanced at her father. "And Miss Calloway." Darius's gaze flickered back toward the terminal. "She has two choices," he said. "She can let today be her downfall." His voice lowered slightly. "Or she can learn from it." Amari smirked. "Let's see which one she picks." And with that, they drove away, leaving behind the terminal, the judgment, and Miss Calloway's former career. But the memory of today, that would last forever. The ripple effect of a mistake. A career in freefall. Miss Evelyn Calloway sat in the cold, sterile office of Lax's corporate wing. She had been here before, but never like this. Never as the subject of a termination meeting. The large conference table felt suffocating, the overhead lights too bright. Two senior executives sat across from her, their expressions unreadable. One of them, Mr. Langford, adjusted his glasses and folded his hands on the table. "Miss Calloway, do you understand why we're here?" She inhaled sharply, forcing herself to remain composed. "I assume this is regarding Flight 247. A brief silence. Then Langford nodded. "Yes. As you know, Mr. Holloway has made it clear that discrimination, whether intentional or not, has no place in this airline." Discrimination. The word hit like a punch to the stomach. She wanted to argue, to say that she hadn't meant to discriminate, that it was just protocol, that she had made an honest mistake. But she couldn't. Not after what had happened. Not after she had stood in front of those two kids and admitted, out loud, that she had assumed they didn't belong. Miss Calloway pressed her lips together. "I regret my actions." The second executive, a woman named Janine Carter, spoke next. "Regret doesn't erase impact." Another silence. Miss Calloway felt her composure cracking. She had worked too hard for too long to have it end like this. "This isn't who I am," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Langford studied her carefully. "Then why did you do it?" Miss Calloway swallowed hard. For the first time in her career, she didn't have an answer. A family conversation. Meanwhile, in the back seat of the black SUV, Mary scrolled through her phone. The news was spreading fast. Multiple passengers from their flight had taken to social media, sharing the story of what had happened, complete with timestamps, photos, and a few choice comments about how Miss Calloway had been escorted off the plane. The headlines were already forming. Flight attendant kicks out 2 siblings, not knowing their father owns the airline. Airline in hot water after executive's children removed from first class. A lesson in power, how assumptions led to career-ending consequences. Zaire sighed, rubbing his eyes. "This is getting big, huh?" Amari turned her screen toward him, showing the trending hashtags. "Bigger than we thought." Darius, seated in the front passenger seat, glanced back. "It was never just about the 2 of you," he said. Amari narrowed her eyes. "Then what was it about?" Darius turned his gaze to the window, watching the city blur past. "Accountability." Zaire leaned forward. "But do you think she'll actually change?" Darius didn't answer right away. Instead, he asked, "Do you want her to?" That question hung in the air for a long moment. Finally, Amari shrugged. "I don't know." Zaire hesitated. "I think so." Darius nodded, as if he had expected that answer. "Then we'll see what she does next." The moment of truth. Back in the corporate office, Miss Calloway had finally run out of defenses. She had answered every question. She had tried to justify, tried to explain. But the reality was simple. She had made an assumption. She had acted on it. And now she was paying for it. Langford sighed and slid a document across the table. "Your resignation." Miss Calloway's breath hitched. "You're not even going to let me fight this." Janine Carter gave her a sharp look. "If it were up to Mr. Holloway, this would be a public firing. You're lucky he's letting you walk away quietly." Miss Calloway swallowed hard. Her hands shook as she picked up the pen. For over a decade, she had been untouchable. Now she was just another name on a resignation form. She signed. And just like that, her career was over. The reflection. That night, Miss Calloway sat alone in her small apartment, staring at the news articles on her phone. Her name wasn't in them. Not yet. But she knew it was only a matter of time. People were talking. Passengers from the flight were sharing their experiences. She had spent years commanding the respect of an airline. And in one day, she had lost everything. Because she had assumed. Her eyes burned, but she refused to cry. Instead, she grabbed her phone, hesitated, then typed out a message. To Darius Holloway. Subject: Apology. Mr. Holloway, I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness, but I want to apologize. Not because I was forced to, but because I now understand the weight of my mistake. I thought I was being professional, but I was being blind. I can't take back what I did, but I will make sure I never make that mistake again. I just wanted you to know that. She stared at the screen. Then, after a long breath, she hit send. And for the first time all day, she didn't feel in control. But maybe, just maybe, that was a good thing. The echo of a mistake. An unread message. Darius Holloway's phone vibrated against the nightstand. The room was dimly lit by the soft glow of the city skyline, and he was seated at his desk, reading through the latest reports from the airline's executive board. He was reviewing internal policies, making notes about mandatory bias training for all employees, and drafting a statement that would ensure that this incident wasn't just handled, but that it never happened again. He glanced at his phone. The notification was simple. One new email. From Evelyn Calloway. For a moment, he did nothing. Then he picked up the phone, opened the email, and read her words. He didn't respond. Instead, he closed the email, placed his phone back on the nightstand, and continued working. Some lessons required more than words. The morning after. By the time the sun rose over Los Angeles, the story had reached national news. The airline had issued a statement. "We deeply regret the incident that took place on Flight 247. We are taking immediate steps to ensure that all of our employees undergo mandatory training to reinforce our commitment to inclusion and fair treatment of all passengers, regardless of background. The employee involved is no longer with our company." No names, no direct mention of what had happened. Just enough words to acknowledge the problem without exposing the depth of it. It wasn't enough. Mary scrolled through her phone at the breakfast table, reading the public responses. Some were praising the airline's swift action. Others were criticizing them for only reacting because the victims had been connected, because they had been important. Mary sighed. They're not wrong. Zaire, sitting across from her, raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Mary looked up. If we weren't Dad's kids, do you really think anything would have happened? Zaire hesitated. I mean, yeah. Right? Darius, who had been pouring himself a cup of coffee at the kitchen counter, glanced over. No. Zaire blinked. Wait. What? Darius leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. If you were just two random kids on that plane, you would have been ignored. She wouldn't have apologized. The airline wouldn't have done anything. And everyone who watched would have gone on with their day, pretending it didn't happen. A heavy silence filled the room. Zaire frowned. So then, it's not fair. Darius sipped his coffee. It never was. Mary placed her phone down, her expression unreadable. So what do we do about that? Darius studied his daughter for a moment before responding. You make sure that the next time this happens, the person in your position does have power. Zaire tilted his head. How? Darius smirked. By making sure the world is watching. A new beginning for some, an ending for others. Across town, Evelyn Calloway sat in her now former office, packing her belongings into a box. The entire airline knew by now. Some had offered her quiet sympathy. Others had avoided eye contact, pretending like she no longer existed. She had been erased. And yet, despite everything, she couldn't bring herself to be angry. Because for the first time, she understood. She had always thought of herself as fair, as someone who upheld the rules. But yesterday, she had been forced to see how those rules had been twisted, how they were applied differently depending on the person in front of her, how she had been the one twisting them. She had spent years assuming she was right. Now she wasn't sure anymore. She set the last item, a framed certificate of appreciation from the airline, into the box and closed the lid. As she turned toward the door, she hesitated. Then, without thinking, she pulled out her phone and checked her email. No response from Darius Holloway. She wasn't surprised. She didn't deserve one. With a quiet breath, she turned off the lights and walked out. She didn't know what she was going to do next. But for the first time, she was willing to learn. Some stories don't end, they echo. Later that night, Mary was lying in bed when her phone vibrated with a notification. She opened it lazily, expecting another news update, another round of strangers debating what had happened on the plane. But instead, it was a message from Hannah. Hannah, just thought you should know. A few flight attendants were talking about what happened. Some of them were angry at Calloway, but others, they were thinking. Like really thinking. I don't know if it changes anything, but I think people are listening now. Mary stared at the screen for a long moment. Then she typed a response. Mary, maybe that's enough. She wasn't sure if she believed it, but she hoped it was true.